Hi, I'm Dr. Kyle Varner with Liberty International, here with Dr. Mary Ruwart. You know, aspirin is a great medication for preventative use. I tell all of my patients who are at high risk of heart attack or stroke to take 81 milligrams of aspirin every day. Why? Because it makes their chance of having a heart attack lower, it makes their chance of having a stroke lower, and it makes their chance of dying from a heart attack or stroke lower if they do have it. It's a wonderful medication, a great preventative medication. But what's really interesting is that for about 20 years, this information was known to the scientific community, and the FDA engaged in censorship to keep that information from the American public. Dr. Ruwart, tell us what happened.
Well, in the early 1960s, Bayer Aspirin wanted to put together a packet of aspirin that you would take every day so that you wouldn't have as much risk of heart attack. But the FDA explained that under the 1962 amendments, which had just been passed, that Bayer would have to do quite a few studies, so much so that it decided not to do that. And without those studies, the aspirin manufacturers could not talk about the things that you're discussing right now. And so nobody knew about it until the early 1980s when, the late 1980s when a study was published that with doctors actually taking aspirin, and it was so dramatic, the effect of protection, that they stopped the study early because they felt it was unethical to give placebo and continue that study. So this has really killed about 1.7 million people, as near as I can estimate.
1.7 million people dropping dead from heart attacks and strokes. Mm-hmm. For what? To feed the egos of bureaucrats at the FDA?
Well, these 62 amendments gave the FDA so much power and required them to show that every drug was effective for what it was sold for. So if the Bayer aspirin manufacturers were not going to jump through all these regulatory hoops, the FDA was not going to let them market it.
And the First Amendment simply doesn't apply to businesses in the United States.
That's right. The FDA claims that commercial speech is not protected by the First Amendment, and unfortunately, the courts have agreed.
Folic acid is another interesting case. I tell all of my patients who are females of childbearing potential to take folic acid or prenatal vitamins every day. This is because folic acid can prevent neural tube defects. Neural tube defects are diseases like spina bifida, where the spinal cord protrudes from the vertebral column, or anencephaly, where babies are even born without a brain. These are horrible and devastating birth defects that are almost entirely preventable. And yet the FDA kept this information from American patients as well, didn't they?
That's right. We knew that these neural tube defects could be completely almost eradicated when taking the B vitamin folic acid in the early 80s. But the FDA told the folic acid manufacturers that if it pointed to these scientific publications that they would shut them down. And that's because the folic acid manufacturers had not run through the years of testing that the FDA requires to make that health claim. So, of course, they didn't say anything because they couldn't patent it. They wouldn't be able to recover their development costs because it was just too high. The FDA was just asking way too much. And yet, it took the Center for Disease Control, another government agency, talking about this same thing in the early 90s and recommending that all women of childbearing potential take it. And you would have thought the FDA would have said, okay, folic acid manufacturers, now you can talk about it. But it didn't. It said it would shut them down once again. And then, while it was muzzling the folic acid manufacturers, it started requiring manufacturers of breads and other grain products like cereal to supplement with folic acid, where you don't get the necessary dose oftentimes.
So on the one hand, the government was saying to the folic acid manufacturers, if you talk about the benefits of folic acid, we'll shut you down. On the other hand, they were saying to cereal manufacturers and bread manufacturers, you must put folic acid into your product because of these benefits.
Yes, but of course it waited for about 12 years to do that, 12 or 15 years. So in the meantime, about 10,000 babies in America were born with these defects needlessly, were institutionalized or died. And, there was really, it's just so sad because these amendments that were passed in 1962 that gave the FDA the power to do this were put into place, especially to prevent birth defects in babies from the drug thalidomide that had been marketed in Europe. So instead of having thalidomide problems, we had the American thalidomide, where our babies were born because they didn't have folic acid at the right time, and this was totally unnecessary. This all could have been prevented.
10,000 people whose lives were impacted horribly by devastating birth defects.
Mm-hmm. And many were aborted. I mean, because you can test for this in utero, this neural tube defect. So many were aborted.
Well, I wish I could say this was the only thing the FDA's done, but your book, Death by Regulation, which I've read, catalogs what is essentially a litany of atrocities committed by the FDA against the American people. I mean, we're talking about millions of people whose lives have been cut short because of drugs that weren't available in time or drugs that didn't get brought to market because of the regulations were too onerous. I knew the FDA was a problem before I read this book, but after I read this book, it blew my mind to see how harmful the FDA is to your health.
And that's because we've each lost at least 5 to 10 years of our lives to these regulations.
That sounds like a really astonishing claim, but it's backed up by some really strong statistics and really strong reasoning. I really recommend Death by Regulation. It's an excellent book. Liberty International is a co-publisher of this book, and I would strongly recommend you get it on Amazon. It's already a bestseller, and it will open your eyes to the horrors of government regulation and its unintended consequences.
You'll want to read it because the life you save may be your own.
Well, thank you, Dr. Ruwart. I'm Dr. Kyle Varner with Liberty International, here with Dr. Mary Ruwart, and Death by Regulation is the book. You can get it on Amazon.